In this video, we're going to explore some of the most pivotal battles in the history of classical antiquity. The clashes that have not only shaped the destinies of individual empires and states, but also the course of Western civilization itself. These are just a few examples, and by and large they are relegated for the most part to Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. This is not because those regions are more important than any other region, but just because they tend to tie in well together. We'll analyze, to some degree, the strategies, tactics, and most importantly, the broader political and cultural ramifications of these key battles, and with that, we will start off with the Battle of Marathon. Dating back to 490 BCE, or before Christ, or before the Common Era. The combatants were the Athenian forces versus the Persian forces under King Darius I. The Battle of Marathon was a decisive victory for the Greeks. It marked a major turning point in the Greco-Persian Wars, preventing Persia from conquering Greece. The victory demonstrated the effectiveness of the Greek hoplite tactics and boosted Greek morale. It is famously associated with the legend of the marathon runner, who ran from the battle all the way to Athens to announce the victory. He died shortly afterwards, but we honor him with the marathon race. Next on the list is the Battle of Zama, dating back to 202 BCE. This was a battle between the Roman Republic under Scipio Africanus versus the Carthaginian forces. The importance of the Battle of Zama ended the Second Punic Wars. These were a series of wars between Rome and the Phoenician city-state of Carthage. The Phoenicians were a people group from what is now Lebanon who set up colonies around the Mediterranean, most notably that of Carthage, which is now located in Tunisia. The victory decisively defeated the Carthaginian general Hannibal, who at that point was one of the most formidable adversaries of Rome and one of the greatest military geniuses in history. This was a guy who had crossed the Alps on elephant back, yet the Romans managed to still defeat this guy. This eventually forced the Carthaginians to sue for peace, effectively ending their status as a major power player in the Western Mediterranean and cementing Rome's dominance in the region. Hannibal's defeat also led to his eventual exile and the decline of Carthage. Next on the list is the Battle of Alesia, dating back to 52 BCE. My pronunciation is terrible, forgive me. The battle was between the Roman forces under a guy you may have heard of, called Julius Caesar. Yeah, I know, he's kind of obscure, isn't he? Well, he was fighting a group of Gallic tribes. The Gauls were pretty much an old word for what is now the Celtic people groups that made up what is now France. Today you probably think of Celts being gingers in Ireland or Scotland, but the Celts actually ran most of Western Europe at the time, even though they weren't a unified people group. With this stunning defeat, the Romans managed to subjugate a great deal of the Celts in what is now France. It's also formidably known for the siege techniques that were revolutionary at the time and prolonged Caesar's reputation as a brilliant military strategist. It also prolonged his military career and solidified Roman control over Gaul. Eventually, with more Romanization, many Gallic peoples, Proto-Frenchmen, would eventually become soldiers in the Roman army, and would eventually be taken up by Germanic peoples and others, creating a synergy between Latin and Germanic languages, leading to what we now know as France. Speaking of Germanic people, we now get to the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, just 9 years before Christ's birth. This was a battle between the Roman forces and various Germanic tribes, led by a guy called Arminius. You may have heard of the word Arminius or Armania. For example, in the Arabic language, the word for Germany is Armania, and there's a reason for this. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest was epic. Here was the Roman army, the greatest military force on the face of the planet, with an arguable exception of what was going on in Han China, and they got defeated by a group of Germanic barbarians, led by a chieftain called Arminius, who ambushed and nearly completely destroyed their forces. Not one, not two, but 3 Roman legions were defeated. This loss severely disrupted Roman plans to expand in Germanic territory and marked the end of Roman expansion beyond the Rhine River. The Celts were one thing to conquer, but the Germanic people groups were a totally different story. This led to a rethinking of Roman strategy in the region, and would eventually set the stage for the Germanic people's conquest of much of Western Europe and their eventual dominance. Next on the list also has to do with the Romans. We're really sticking a lot to the Romans right now. And that is the end of the Jewish revolt and the fall of Jerusalem 70 years after Christ. Now, we've all heard the story of Jesus, but this is not a story about religion or a video about religion, it's about military battles. Well, after Jesus died, there was a great deal of unrest among what you now would call Judea and Israel. After all, the Jewish people had been greatly suppressed by the Romans. To what extent this had to do with the crucifixion of Christ is another matter. Nonetheless, the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the Second Temple at the hands of Romans marked the end of the Jewish revolt against Roman rule. The Roman army, led by Titus, besieged and eventually captured Jerusalem after months of fierce fighting. The Temple of Jerusalem was destroyed, and many Jews were killed and enslaved. This event led to the diaspora of the Jewish people, scattering across much of the Roman Empire and ending a significant Jewish presence in Jerusalem for centuries. It also marked a significant turning point for Judaism as a religion, as the development of Rabbinic Judaism, stemming from the Pharisees, would eventually become the dominant form. With the destruction of the temple, much of the Jewish temple elites were gone, and as a result, you saw the rise of the synagogue and rabbis. This was far more decentralized and would become the dominant version for centuries, if not millennia to come, which made sense given the fact that the Jews were now a diaspora group. Now, the Romans like conquering people and sacking cities. Well, what goes around comes around. And the last video on the list is the sack of Rome, dating back to 410 BCE. This is a battle between the Visigoth forces. These were a Germanic tribe under Alaric I, versus the Roman Empire. This eventually resulted in the sack of Rome, one of the most shocking events of the late Western Roman Empire. After all, the Roman Empire at this point was split into two: the Western Roman Empire, which was far more poor and weak than the Eastern Roman Empire. The Western Roman Empire would eventually be besieged and looted, ending rule across much of Western Europe. Keep in mind that it had been 8 centuries since Rome had been captured by a foreign enemy. This was just unthinkable at the time. The sack symbolized and solidified the decline of the Western Roman Empire and the loss of Roman power in the West. Keep in mind that the Eastern Roman Empire still continued for about another 1,000 years. However, in Western Europe, much of the economies and political structures would be fragmented and decentralized into feudalism, oftentimes at the hands of barbarian invasions and decay. And if you're interested in decay, my next video is on some of the most important battles of the Middle Ages.